Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks, your in-depth analysis and discussion of current events in the Western Balkans.
Welcome to Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks. My name is Florian Bieber and I'll be hosting today's episode. We'll be looking at the election results in North Macedonia. North Macedonia held both presidential and parliamentary elections in April and May of this year, and the results brought with them a clear victory for the conservative nationalist VMRO DPMNE, or the party with the longest name in the Western Balkans, namely the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization Democratic Party for Macedonian National Unity. Their presidential candidate, Gordana Siljanovska Davkova, won with nearly 70% of the vote the second round of the presidential elections, and the leader of the VMRO, Hristijan Micovski, won for his party an overwhelming victory in the parliamentary elections, gaining 58 out of 120 seats, while the so far dominant Social Democratic Union gathered only 18 seats, a dramatic drop from previous election results. So what these results mean, what the implications are for the country and the region, is something we'll be looking at in today's episode.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
Today we're going to be talking about the election results in North Macedonia, both the presidential and the parliamentary elections. And we're joined by Simonida Kacarska from the European Policy Institute in Skopje and Lura Pollozhani at the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz and a member of BiEPAG. So thanks for joining us today. And my first question goes to Simonida. What are your main takeaways? I mean, the election results in many ways were expected, that there would be a victory for the conservative nationalist VMRO DPMNE. But what are other kind of aspects of the results which maybe surprised you, or which you consider to be important takeaways?
Thanks, Florian. Yeah, I think the first surprise probably was how low the support for the Social Democrats went. Most of the analysis in the country, also by people belonging to the Social Democrats following the 8th of May, were calculations as to how much they have underperformed in comparison to even some of the worst performances they had over the years. In this sense, I think that most of the people are actually reflecting as to what will SDSM do forward. And this is probably the main one of the first takeaway. The second, which is more concerning, is also the going back to the nationalist discourse that we have encountered over times. There were attempts to kind of tame it in 2017 by integrating mostly Albanian voters to the SDSM platform. But in my view, when I was speaking back then, that could have been, had it been done properly, that could have been the major transformation of the Macedonian political system that we have been expecting, or the mode of operation of political parties. But we're back to our ethnic camps because the nationalist rhetoric that we encountered, both from VMRO but also from DUI and so on, has been very much concerning. That's probably the concerning point after the surprising one. And to end on a positive note, and I think we should not underestimate that the transfer of power the election results were taken, at least so far, by the major political parties in the Macedonian camp, were taken as a reality, and there was no contestation in that context. The election day was very peaceful. We should not really undermine that. Some of these countries really are performing in terms of elections. North Macedonia has shown actually that, with many of the objections by the ODHR and the OSCE on sometimes last minute in the electoral code, which has been our long-term illness, otherwise these elections were rather peaceful.
Okay, thanks, Simonida. Lura, what are your main takeaways? Do you agree with Simonida's points? Would you add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, one of the key kind of differences, although it's not a difference, is that Vomero, having won with such a large margin, really makes it quite a majority. At least I wasn't expecting for them to win so big. And this kind of places it in a very good position vis-a-vis who it chooses as a coalition partner. Because throughout the electoral campaign, they have said that, for example, they will not coalition with DUI, even if DUI were to win the majority, but that they would choose to coalition with VLEN, the other kind of cluster of Albanian parties or coalition of Albanian parties. And this has really, during the electoral campaign, we saw DUI kind of stress because of this. They don't want to stay out of power. This would be the first time they stay out of power in the last 16 years, 20 and more, if we don't take into account the 2-year break that Vomero chose DPA. Which, by the way, led to early elections because of DUI in opposition, kind of pushing for re-elections all the time. But now the tables have changed because DUI in the 2017 government then chose to coalition with SDSM. So they broke this rule of victors go with victors. And Vomero is able to use that. And it would be nice to see DUI in opposition, but it would be, interestingly, the leader of the opposition, because it has 19 seats to the 18 seats that SDSM has, although SDSM won more votes, but less percentage in terms of mandates because of how the electoral system is divided into zones. So it would be interesting to see DUI in opposition, to say the least, in the sense of both how the party will choose to deal with this phenomenon of opposition, but also how it chooses to act in parliament. This is also to add to the fact that the coalition that DUI has led is not only made up of DUI, but a lot of smaller parties as well, which makes it not a very, perhaps, powerful coalition, in the sense that, the different coalition partners may choose to go different ways. And this is also something that goes for VLEN as well, because VLEN also has this amalgam of parties that perhaps don't see eye to eye when it comes to everything. So it will be interesting to see who exactly makes it in the government led by Vomero, whether it will be all coalition partners of VLEN or not. Because of how splintered these parties are, I would technically foresee a future where they could perhaps split. And I would agree with Simonida about the return of nationalism. And these elections, it hasn't just been this internal, perhaps the internal nationalism has been less, and by internal, I mean between the ethnic communities in the countries, has been less clear or less, let's say, utilized. It's been more this nationalism vis-a-vis the neighbor countries emanating from the dispute with Bulgaria. And also because I think political leaders were kind of trying to play it smart. It's obvious that many of them are nationalists. But for example, I think Vomero de Polmene now knows that the Albanian electorate can be quite punishing, and it could kind of punish in terms of supporting SDSM or other actors. So they were all this time trying to be like, oh, but Albanians, you should also believe us when we tell you that DUI also corrupts and da-da-da. So in that sense, it was less pronounced, but I think it was definitely there. And I think we're going to see kind of this carefulness or this kind of curated nationalism, which was sort of held in check, but not really, bloom with the new government, perhaps.
Thanks. Maybe just a few words to the smaller parties. I mean, one of the striking phenomena in North Macedonia is the kind of stability of the party system in many ways, with the two large center-left and center-right parties dominating, since independence very much, and then having at least two large Albanian parties competing, and not a breakthrough for other parties. So we had, two parties running and entering parliaments, Levica and Znam. So how are these parties on the margins? How is their role going to be in the future parliament, or what does it tell us about the party system, Simonida?
Yeah, the Levica and Znam at the moment have 12 members of parliament, which is 10%, which is probably not that little of a number to call them anymore marginal. Levica have been operating for some time now. They had 2 members of parliament in the previous composition, and they usually prey on the disappointment of the public with the long transition. They have tried to position themselves as an alternative to those two camps, mostly in the Macedonian bloc, even though they tried discursively sometimes to label themselves as the representatives of the poor Albanians or the poor Roma. The real surprise of these elections, and probably it should have gone in in my first response, was actually ZNAM, a party that was established by the mayor of Kumanovo, who belonged to SDSM. Going back to your first question, we have experienced such splinter parties even before, among VMRO mostly in the early 2000s. And this is a trend that we are now more. SDSM had one, Tito Petkovski, and then this is the next one, but the result has been quite outstanding for the first time that they will stand in parliament, and with all of the challenges for small parties that Lura mentioned before. The question for them at the moment, most of the media post-elections in the country would say that ZNAM is a strong potential ally of VMRO and Mickovski. They have turned away from SDSM on many grounds, but also on the way that the issue with Bulgaria was handled. Because they discursively they argue that they will negotiate or they will work towards negotiating a new negotiating framework for EU accession. Which is closer to VMRO's position. The big in this government, they're likely in the new government of VMRO, they're likely to be a significant partner. The question for some of these parties remains because they don't, in terms of the membership, the level of discipline that they will have within. And how will that group actually continue to operate? But it's a remarkable success for a party that was very recently established, and that has made it with such big numbers in the parliament within the Macedonian political system.
Regarding Vlen, which you mentioned, Lura, I mean, you said it's of course it's been able to get into second place and be a strong challenger to DUI, but it's also heterogeneous, as you mentioned. Is there any kind of programmatic coherence there besides their opposition to the long prevailing dominance of DUI? And where do you think it will take also politics among the Albanian community in North Macedonia in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the greatest pity with this election is that the Albanian electorate, let's say, and not only, really lacked the alternatives, because when we dissect Vlen, then we have political actors who have already been in government before, but they chose in different times to either step out or step in. For example, Arben Taravari as part of the Alliance for Albanians. He used to be Minister of Health, then he got to choose the next Minister of Health at one point. And, you know, in terms of the choices that they made for ministers, perhaps not the best. So we've had a glimpse of what they could be like in government. Then we have Democratic Union, let's call it in English, or the Lidia Democratica Vizet Mejiti, who used to be a DUI mayor of Chair, one of the largest Albanian municipalities, and one of the most important being in Skopje. And then we also have newcomers like Vedvedvendosia branch of in North Macedonia, although I say this a bit more lightly just because I don't think generally it represents any of what Vedvednosia in Kosovo would represent. And then we also have kind of remnants of the party BiEPAG, because also all of these parties, I'm calling them remnants because most of the parties that are part of Vlen right now are splinter parties. So Arben Taravari, for example, split from the Alliance from Albanians of Ziadin Sela. They're still in contest as to who's the legitimate leader of the party. Ziadin Sela coalition with DUI. You also have inside BiEPAG different fractions. So in that sense, it's really not a coherent or cohesive group at all. And it's also not a new group, except for Vedvendosia representative. All of these guys, and they are guys, we've seen them before. So they're not surprises. Like, we can know what to expect from them. And programmatically, I think the biggest problem is that they were very much just the anti-DUI party. And I think that kind of made them lazy in terms of offering anything substantially new to the table, because in the end of the day, I mean, the DUI coalition called itself the European Front, but it's not that the VLEM parties are anti-EU. They're all pro-EU generally in that sense. So I don't think programmatically there would be any big difference, because so far, at least, the rhetoric has been more like, we let those guys steal until now, so let us now do not the stealing. They wouldn't say that, of course, but that's really the sense that you get, that, they've had enough. They've had enough of benefits. Now let us have some of those benefits, and let us kind of also, with us, it also is to imply the people who vote for these coalitions, right? So it's a bigger us than just the political parties. But in terms of program, they haven't offered anything concrete, and it also they wouldn't be positioned the same way as they were positioned with SDSM. And I think this is very important, just because SDSM didn't have as large of a majority in both of the last elections. So it kind of had to coalition with more partners. So it was more dependent on their needs. Whereas VMRO really doesn't need VLEN to create a government. It can also go with ZNAM or, Levica, although with Levica, I don't think Levica would agree. And I don't think VMRO would agree. But it just means that, the dynamics of the next coalition will be very different. So it will really kind of make the cluster or the space for Albanian parties to operate in government quite different to what we've seen until now. So I also don't think they could make potentially very large changes if they wanted to.
Considering the very strong showing, which both of you mentioned, over Moro de Pomene, and already the first kind of diplomatic incident we had during the inauguration of the new president, Gordana Siljanovska-Davkova, over her not using the full name, including the North in the name. What can we expect of the new government? What are the kind of, can we expect this nationalist rhetoric during the electoral campaign to translate into policy and into further tensions with both Bulgaria and Greece? What are also the domestic constellations we can expect? We've already heard some potential coalitions. Simonida, what's your take?
Absolutely. The first, one of the major concerns with the sweeping victory of VMRO has been how will they now position themselves in terms of the European integration and in terms of relations with the neighbors. It will be hard to tame the nationalist rhetoric that we already mentioned. However, there is a sense also post-elections in the country that we should wait to see how VMRO will position themselves. We expect that there's still a question mark as to how will the coalition agreement look like, and what will be the principles of that agreement, because it will be hard to go with that rhetoric even with any Albanian partner in the government, and this is something that Lura mentioned previously. While not mentioning the name North Macedonia, most of the speech of the new president, in post the elections has been towards working for consensus, and declaratively they have been supporting European integration, but we're still yet to see how and if will this materialize. I think it's very early. The first signals have been very concerning because during the inauguration there was a lot of backlash and warnings from a couple of mostly capitals in our surrounding, starting with Athens, then with Sofia, about the fact that the agreements won't be renegotiated, which is clear to all of us. How and in what way will the new government balance between that emphasis of renegotiating with the agreements, which we know is off the table, to deliver something on the matter will be an issue, because after the first 100 days or so, after the honeymoon period, we go back to the basic questions of the Macedonian public, which relate to the quality of life, which relate to anti-corruption, rule of law reforms, which contributed to SDSM falling in the way that they did. We are likely to see what we should also notice, that with the numbers that VMRO has, they will have a much more comfortable position. Any government that they form will have a much more comfortable position in comparison to what we have seen in the last 7 years, because the SDSM-led coalition never had more than 61 MPs. We were often one out of 120. We were often wondering what they could deliver on the domestic front. This will not be the case with VMRO. But there are always the main concern that in everyone's mind when you ask this question is if they will go to practices from between 2011 and 2015, and this is probably a lump in the throat of many of the people living in the country.
Right. This is, I think, what you've alluded to, Simonida, and maybe I'll also take this question to Lura, is not so much the nationalist confrontations with neighbors, but more the authoritarianism which VMRO experienced under, especially in the previous Prime Minister Gruevski. And, can we see a return of that kind of authoritarianism? Has the party changed? I mean, the nationalist rhetoric is there, but the authoritarianism, the clampdown on media freedoms, all of that, which led, in fact, to the mass protests in 2015 and 2016. Is there a fear of a return of that particular type of rule in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, ever since VMRO got this majority, but even before, I was very often reflecting of what VMRO was in terms of a government. And we all remember perhaps the social movements and what led to them, or maybe we've forgotten. But I do think there is this kind of danger sometimes of equating, because SDSM now lost elections, that, they're just as bad. And I like to say that they're not. And I think the reason that they're not is exactly these practices. Although SDSM did have its moments of, let's say, undemocratic practices, sometimes especially in relations to the media, they were never VMRO. And also, I always like to remind people just how bad things got before the movement, in the sense that, people were very scared. They were scared of contradicting anything that the VMRO government would do publicly, because they had shrunk the space so much. And we haven't seen a party that has owned up to its past mistakes at all. And I think one of the things that has bothered me the most during the electoral campaign is that we had, for example, Mickoski speak against corruption when his party is still rife with lots of cases of corruption that kind of never saw the light of day in the end, because of the very sad end of the special prosecutor's office. And sad because, if you remember, the special prosecutor herself, the main special prosecutor, ended in jail due to bribery. So in that sense, I really don't know if we have a different VMRO, because it hasn't reformed much. You still have a lot of the players who used to be in the last government still around in the party, still very influential. So I'm very wary, and I do think we should be wary, considering just how large of a majority they are, because, again, the party can change. I would be very happy if the party changed its practices, but I'm also worried in the sense of just how big of a majority it has. And for example, if it chose VLEN as a coalition party, it would have 71 members of parliament, which is so a big majority in parliament. And as Simonida said, there's also a good relationship with ZNAM, whether they put them in the government or just choose them as kind of these parliamentary partners, let's say. This could have serious implications where we could have a weak opposition, and hopefully that won't be the case. DUI is good at causing trouble sometimes as opposition. We've seen in the 2 years it was opposition. So in that sense, I hope we have some sort of an effective opposition. So I don't know. I think, although I don't want to be, the doomsayer, and understandably this is a new government in some ways, but I do think we should always be a bit wary, just so that we can not repeat the mistakes of the past.
Thanks, Lura. Yes, indeed. I think we have to wait and see. There, of course, there is the legacy of the past government and these small statements, which are signs which we have to be observing carefully, and we'll have to wait and monitor the situation. Well, Simonida, Lura, thanks for joining the Seriously Balkan podcast today, and thanks for your insight.
Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks.
This is it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the analysis, and we'll listen in again on future episodes of Seriously Balkans.
You've been listening to Seriously Balkans, the BiEPAG Talks. This podcast is produced by the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, a joint project of the European Fund for the Balkans and the Center for Southeast European Studies of the University of Graz. Find out more about our research, analysis, and advocacy at www.biepag.eu.